Hi, I'm Mark David Gerson. Welcome to Stories and Reflections, where my stories are also yours. Last Thursday was the 42nd anniversary of my mother's death. Edith Plotnick Gerson Rabinsky died shortly after nightfall on Monday, March 26, 1984, in Montreal's Jewish General Hospital. 42 years. That's a lot of years. And all those years means my mother has been physically absent from my life more than twice as long as she was ever physically present in it. I'm also nearly a decade older than she was when she died. Sobering thoughts, in a way. They speak to my longevity, for which I'm mostly grateful, and her lack of it, which I still mostly mourn. And I'll come back to what I mean by mostly in a bit. When we're young, our parents never seem quite human, certainly not in the ordinary way we view other adults. Our parents are beings apart somehow. And unless they share stories from their childhood and teens, or even from the early days of their marriage, which my parents never did, it's as though they don't have an existence independent of being our parents. And even as we get older and watch our parents age, they're still more mom and dad than individuals in their own right. And their histories, whatever we know of them, can seem nearly as abstract and separate from our own lives as was the history we read in our high school textbooks. Now, maybe none of that is quite true for you, especially if you grew up with stacks of photo albums dating back generations. I didn't. One could say that my growing up years were a kind of dance between looking ahead and staying grounded in the present. But that wouldn't really be accurate. My mother wasn't some kind of metaphysical Earth Mother hippie into meditation and other spiritual practices like living in the moment. Wrong generation. Edith Plotnick was born in the years following World War I and spent her teen years navigating the Depression. It's more accurate to say that growing up for me was one long exercise in never looking back, because my mother never did. It wasn't until after she was gone that I learned some of her history. By then, I was living in Toronto, as was her oldest friend, Sophie Katz. Edith and Sophie had met more than a half a century earlier in the schoolyard at Montreal's King Edward VII Elementary, and they'd remained close through all that time, even when they were living in different cities or countries. A few months after my mother's death, I called Sophie and invited myself up to her North York home so she could tell me some of the stories I never heard from my mother. The most dramatic of the stories she told me is the one I share in episode 3. That's the startling story, startling to me anyhow. That's the startling story about my Gerson father not being my birth father. Now, that's definitely a story my mother never shared with me. It's unlikely that she shared it with anyone other than Sophie. And that she even shared it with Sophie still kind of surprises me. Now, I won't repeat that story here, but check it out in episode 3. It truly is a stunner of a story. Another story my mother never shared was about my older brother Michael, who died before I was born. Today, you would have said he had Down syndrome, but back then in the early 1940s, he was called retarded and was institutionalized. I mentioned him as well in episode 3. My mother also never talked about her parents, both of whom also died before I was born. Sophie shared some of those stories as well, and I discovered that although my mother loved Sidney Gerson, who was 9 years older and a successful architect when they met, one of the reasons for rushing into that marriage when she was barely 20 was to get away from her mother, who was apparently somewhat overbearing. According to Sophie, maybe a whole lot more than somewhat. Was it a happy marriage? It's hard to know. Sidney was severely diabetic, something my mother didn't discover until just before the wedding, and his condition deteriorated so much that I have few memories of him when he wasn't in poor health, or worse, hospitalized. Happy or not, it must have been difficult. And maybe that explains the affair my mother had in Ottawa during the war. That's World War II. And the man she had the affair with would, a decade later, become my natural father. By then, of course, the affair was long over, and I tell that story in more detail in episode 3. I do remember that after Sidney died of a heart attack at age 56, it was as though the years of stress that had prematurely aged Edith suddenly melted away. By then, she had already been a de facto single mom to me and my sister for quite a few years. And when she remarried about 5 years later, it always struck me that it wasn't for love. Affection, maybe. Companionship, possibly. But mostly security. Not that I blame her. Trying to support 2 kids and a sick husband cannot have been easy. And even if some of that stress had eased up with a sick husband gone, there were still 2 kids to support, one of whom, not me, was an increasingly rebellious teen who ended up getting pregnant. Certainly not me. Still, giving up a financially challenging independence for a financially secure but emotionally challenging dependence also can't have been easy. And I think it was a trade-off that weighed on her more and more as the years passed. So much so that when she was diagnosed with cancer, I think she did little more than go through the motions when it came to treatment. I even think she had maybe begun to welcome the cancer as an escape from a life she didn't see as having been much of a success. I already knew she blamed herself for me being gay. She was fixated on the whole strong single mother, weaker absent father stereotype. And at some level, she was just as ashamed of this as she was of her perceived responsibility for my sister's teen pregnancy, my brother Michael's Down syndrome, and my unconventional conception, the wrong father. Maybe she even regretted her marriages, both of them. But the first time I really sensed her regret and maybe her readiness to give up was one winter evening about 18 months before her death. I was still living in Montreal then, and I had gone to the house to see my mother for our regular routine of dinner and Scrabble. Afterward, we sat side by side on the floor in the darkened living room, waiting for my stepfather to get home so he could drive me to the subway. By then, chemotherapy had thinned Edith's thick hair into silk. Now it's natural white, though tinted, like our faces, a sickly yellow by the streetlight filtering in from outside. She no longer wore her wig around the house, a sign to me that her pride in her appearance had weakened. Or maybe she just couldn't be bothered anymore. I can't remember now whether she looked at me or looked away as she spoke into the silence. "I've made a lot of poor choices in my life," she said softly. Had she already given up? It's impossible to know. What I do know is that by early afternoon on March 26, 1984, she had. She'd been admitted to the hospital a few days earlier, which is why I was back in Montreal. I'd taken the train in from Toronto on Friday afternoon, and had spent most of the weekend since sitting by her hospital bed. Early that afternoon, she began wheezing and struggling for breath. Nurses and inhalation therapists rushed in with oxygen. Weakened though she was, Edith clawed at the oxygen mask, her eyes wide and pleading. She wanted the mask off, and that's when I was certain she had given up. "It's just to make you comfortable," I managed to say and squeezed her hand. She squeezed back weakly and closed her eyes. A few hours later, she was gone. For years, those 2 scenes haunted me. Her confession in the living room, and the moment she tried to refuse the oxygen. I talked last week about my temptations to give up. I was talking, of course, in the context of my frustrations around filming this podcast, and I framed it in the context of trust. Trusting that when I listened to and heeded the voice of my wisest self, that still small voice of infinite wisdom we all carry, I'm always okay, always taken care of. Part of that faith grew out of my mother's experiences and regrets. Now, I didn't have any kind of spiritual awareness while she was still alive, but once I had my spiritual awakening a few years later, I was hugely conscious of not wanting to face the end of my life with the kind of regrets my mother seemed to be expressing, regrets so deep that she seemed ready to give up. What I haven't shared here before, though, are all the times when I felt so despairing and hopeless about my own life that I've thought about ending it, wondered even how I might end it. In retrospect, I don't think that any of my suicidal thoughts have ever been serious enough that I would have acted on them. Still, it's hard to be 100% certain. 2 of those moments remain particularly vivid. The first was in 1997. I was living a few hours north of Toronto on the outskirts of Penetanguishene, a small town at the southeastern tip of Georgian Bay, a massive Lake Huron inlet that's nearly as large as all of Lake Ontario. It was an emotionally intense period, and my book Dialogues with the Divine, Encounters with My Wisest Self is a collection of my journals from those 5 months. "I'm afraid of the emptiness," I wrote in a moment of despair. "I'm afraid it will devour me, destroy me, annihilate me. Emptiness is death." What would happen if I took my life, I wondered that gloomy January morning, not entirely academically? Who would notice? What would happen to Roxy? Roxy, if you remember from episode 10, where I tell how she and I were together, sprayed by a skunk, was my Cocker Spaniel. Without Roxy in my life, what would I have done? Honestly, I don't know. 22 years later, I was in Northern California driving up I-5 to Mount Shasta. It was during one of the open-ended road journeys I mentioned here before. That one I'd felt forced to undertake because my finances had completely collapsed. I couldn't afford to stay in Portland, where I'd been living for 19 months. I'd moved there from Albuquerque. Here's how I described that moment in my memoir chronicling that odyssey, Pilgrimage, A Fool's Journey. The despair I felt was overwhelming. Nothing I could say or do would shake it. I'm 3 months from my 65th birthday, I muttered. And what have I accomplished? Sure, I may have written a bunch of books, but I'm still homeless. I'm still penniless. I still don't know where I'm going or why I'm bothering to go on. For more of the same? What's the point of it, of any of it? In that instant, the highway veered sharply to the right. Ahead of me, a flimsy guardrail was all that stood between me and a sheer drop into a jagged valley. Could I? Could I say fuck it all, smash through the guardrail and... Not for the first time in a moment of bleakest hopelessness on that journey, two things stopped me. My dog Kiri, who lay sleeping in his bed on the passenger seat next to me, and my daughter, thousands of miles away in her Chicago college apartment. I couldn't take an innocent animal's life simply to ease my emotional pain, and I couldn't burden my daughter with a parent's suicide. So, absent those two factors, would I have done it? Could I? I'd like to think not. But again, I just don't know. Those haven't been the only times I've had feelings of really, truly wanting to give up in a no-take-backs kind of way. Maybe they come in part from the feeling I've had through most of my life of not really belonging. After all, I didn't really belong to my father, the Sidney Gerson father. As I noted in episode 7, he never did anything to disabuse me of that feeling. Then, just before I turned 14, he was gone. And I certainly never belonged to my birth father, who never acknowledged me as his. I grew up Jewish and English-speaking in French Catholic Quebec. I came out as gay just a few years after Stonewall, when homosexuality still carried a huge stigma. So much so that my mother could never talk about it to anyone, except me, including her husband, my stepfather. Nor have I ever had much of any other kind of sense of family belonging. My older sister and I were never close. Even so, she's gone. She died 8 years ago. And as an immediate family, we were never all that close with the extended family of aunts, uncles, cousins, and grandparents. And although I'm now an American citizen, my residual Canadianness means I don't feel fully as though I fit in here. At the same time, though, I've lived in this country long enough, more than half my adult life, that I doubt I would feel fully at home were I to move back to Canada. It's like I was born an outsider. And my approach to many things has often been not only outside the mainstream, but outside the mainstream of whatever minorities I happen to be part of. Now, much of the time, maybe even most of the time, I don't mourn those differences. I value them. I celebrate them. The independent thought, the singular path. My mother's death, in fact, 42 years ago last week, freed me to pursue that singular path. My mother rarely pressured me to be or do anything other than what I chose to be or do. Yet as courageous as I allowed myself to be while she was still alive, coming out as gay, moving away from my hometown, quitting my full-time job to freelance, many of my choices and actions were colored by how I thought she might respond and were filtered through her worldview. And when she died, when I was only 28, she took all of her hopes, fears, and expectations for me with her. It was kind of liberating. I said a bit ago that I doubt I would ever have given up in the ways my mother did, that I would ever have seriously acted on any of my fleeting suicidal thoughts. But something a couple of weeks ago has made me rethink that. While the rest of North America and perhaps the world obsesses over Netflix, one of my favorite streaming services is called MHZ Choice, and it features mostly foreign and foreign language content. A couple of weeks ago, I was watching an episode of a French mystery on MHZ Choice. It's called Cassandra, and a part of the story involved a subplot about a woman with a terminal degenerative disease. About halfway through the episode, we discover that she has secretly made plans for an assisted suicide. She hasn't told her daughter, and she hasn't told her husband. By the end of the episode, though, she's changed her mind. Instead of opting for secrecy and death, she chooses vulnerability in life. And in the moment when she reveals all to her daughter and her husband, I start to cry. I want to live, I hear myself say, over and over and over again through my tears. If I never chose death, as my mother sort of did with her cancer diagnosis, I'm realizing in light of my reaction to that episode that maybe I also never chose life. I just sort of coasted in that in-between place, never committing to either leaving or staying. That February night all those years ago, when my mother expressed her regrets in the darkness of her living room. Her living room, how ironic. I'm just seeing that now. It was in her living room. Anyhow, in that moment, I vowed that I would choose differently, that I wouldn't, as I said a bit ago, end my life full of regrets. Still, that too was a negative choice. A choice about what I wouldn't do or be. I didn't choose life in that living room. I chose no regrets. I've been thinking a lot about that episode of Cassandra as I've been remembering my mother this week. And I've been thinking less about the choices she would have wanted me to have made while she was still alive. Choices she might have wanted me to make before cancer focused her mind. Choices for safety. Choices for security. Choices to mitigate risk. Choices to anchor certainty. The kinds of choices I began to let go of more and more fully in the years after her death. I've been thinking instead about the choices she would want me to make today, now, from that place, whatever that place is, wherever that place is, that she is now, where her spirit is now. I'd like to think my mother would be cheering my choices. Choices for creativity. Choices for authenticity. Choices for surrendering to my intuition and the voice of my wisest, most intuitive self. Choices for living my passion. Choices for living my truth. Choices for leaps of faith. Choices for trusting in the hidden 92% I talked about in last week's episode. Many of the choices, in fact, that she was never able to make for herself. But I think the choice that would elicit from her the most cheers and the most encouragement would be the choice I made in the final moments of that episode of that MHZ Choice show a few weeks ago, the choice for life. Finally, at the start of my 8th decade, I choose life. Thanks, Mom, wherever you are. Thanks for joining me for Stories and Reflections today. I hope you found moments in my stories that touched something in yours. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And for more of my stories and help telling yours, check out my books at markdavidgerson.com or from online booksellers worldwide. Until next time, don't forget that you're a storyteller too, and keep telling your stories. The intro and outro music for today's episode is Heartwarming by Kevin MacLeod from Incompetech.com, licensed under Creative Commons.